Okay, let's get started. Welcome to today's edition of the live webcast from the Objector Church. Our website is at objector.church, and your speaker today is myself, James M. Branum. I'm one of the ministers of the Objector Church, and we're so happy you're here with us today. I also have to apologize for starting late today. Had some traffic difficulties and childcare difficulties and other things. It all worked out in the end, but again, I apologize for running late getting started today. So for today's program, we're going to be talking a little bit about the winter holidays, particularly why the modern version of the winter holidays for many of us feels insincere, weird as all get out, and why maybe there are some other ways of doing the winter holidays that might be more life-giving and helpful. And for that, we're going to be going back to history, but also to prehistory, to the earliest days when human beings were speaking to each other, making sense of their world, but had not yet developed written language. So we'll be talking about that because there's some significant elements there, I think, that can give us some insight and wisdom to our present moments. But before we do that, I want to deal with a few administrative details. First of all, if you're watching this for the first time, the Objector Church is a religious humanist community that focuses on peace and social justice issues. We are universalist in nature, meaning that everyone is welcome who can find meaning in what we do and especially resonates with the ideas of peace and social justice. You can find out more about us at our website, objector.church, or look for us on social media. We'd love to have you participate any way you can, participating in our weekly meetups, some of our local events that are happening sometimes in Oklahoma City and in Oakland, California, and some of the other things happening over time. We are just in the early stages of developing also some adult learning classes through the Objector Institute. And there'll be more information about that over time. One of our classes we've just started working on is online at objector.institute. So I encourage you to check it out, but we're at the very early stages of this. We do have a class coming up, hopefully maybe this week we'll start doing some recording on the Tao Te Ching from ancient China. So again, I'm hoping that these will be classes of interest, and go ahead and check them out as we start producing them, and there'll be more information about that on social media and whatnot. Also to mention, this Friday, we have a very special event happening in Oklahoma City. We are doing a live remote webcast at Nappy Roots Bookstore. Nappy Roots Bookstore is Oklahoma City's only Black-owned bookstore. There we go. And it's located at Northeast 36th and Kelly. It's a fantastic place. It is a bookstore that has all kinds of books of a general interest, but also quite a bit of more, for lack of a better word, politically subversive in the best way that can be said. Books that celebrate African-American culture, indigenous culture, that celebrate resistance, that celebrate pride for who people are. There's just a lot of good stuff at Nappy Roots Books. So we want to show some support to them. And so we're doing this event partially as what we may do a series of these over time of going and doing live remote events at different nonprofit, social justice-oriented, or just local community businesses that we like, to encourage folks to connect with their community in a deeper way. So we'll be doing these periodically. We're kind of modeling these. If you've heard on commercial radio stations, you hear these cheesy, we're doing a live remote at such and such car dealership or grocery store, whatever. So we're going to do this too, but do it from our perspective, which is bringing attention not to people trying to make lots of money, but instead bringing attention to community organizations, to things like being the only Black-owned bookstore in Oklahoma City. Bring attention to stuff like that. So we're hoping is if you're in Oklahoma that you'll come on Friday night and meet me. We'll be filming live there. Camille and Ben Boucher will be there from the bookstore. And we're going to be having a conversation about several topics. We're talking about Kwanzaa, the African-American holiday, and talking about its history and modern significance. We'll also be talking about the Cuban Revolution and some of the interesting and tricky issues there for peace and social justice activists. Of course, we'll be talking about the present day context of the immoral blockade of the U.S. against Cuba, but we'll also be talking about things like the morality or not morality of violence and revolution. When is it appropriate? When is it not? As a peace and social justice organization, this is one of those times when peace and social justice don't always, there's some tension there. So we're going to talk about it. And we're expecting lots of different viewpoints, which I think is awesome and wonderful. And so I really encourage you to come on out. Be from 5 to probably about 6:30 p.m. this Friday, Nappy Ritz Bookstore. We're posting that on social media. For those of you watching online from other locales, if you can't make it to the bookstore, join us in the webcast and ask us questions. We'd love for you to be part of the conversation. Last administrative detail I want to mention is that we are thinking about changing the time and day of this weekly webcast. I really like having a consistent day and time, but as far as building an audience, we have not had the audience buildings we'd like on this Tuesday time, the daytime. So we're looking at some other options. Nothing is firm yet. I'm hoping to have something decided this week, though. So if you're a regular watcher of this and you have some ideas, or if you're watching this recorded format later but would love to participate live, it was at a better time, please let us know what you think. Send me an email at james@objector.church, and it would be very helpful if you gave me some ideas of what would be good times and days for you for us to have these live webcasts. Or you can post it on our social media as well. So, to begin, though, let's move now into our regular format, which is our programs we seek to always have: inspiration, information, interaction. Interaction will come throughout this whole program, and if you have comments, questions, thoughts, we'll encourage you to share them with us. In fact, right now, by the way, I mentioned that Rena, one of our members of our church and supporters, she's monitoring the Facebook page. And so I'm going to also turn on Facebook here over on the over on my phone as well, so I can monitor a little bit better. Let's see here. Oh, well, Rena, if you get this, I'll have my Facebook Messenger open, so if there's any good comments, ping me there or send me a text. But on Zoom, I'll be monitoring them here. Rena will be monitoring them on Facebook. And so if you have comments you'd like to have read over the webcast, please post them. We'd love to have your comments. I always have time at the end, especially for anything that didn't get raised earlier. But if you have comments along the way, you'd like to join the conversation, that's great. Today, though, I wanted to look at those, particularly the winter holidays. And talked about earlier, or many of us, what we have here in North America and growing in other parts of the world is this consumer Christmas. It begins at Black Friday, the beginning of the holiday shopping season. After that is endless parties and events and buying. Sometimes you're buying presents for loved ones you care about. Sometimes you're buying presents for people you don't even like, but you feel obligated to buy them presents for this way or that way. And by the time we get to Christmas, it's all been happy, joy, pump yourself up. Family gatherings, work get-togethers. Be happy, whether you feel like it or not. You must be happy. And then it's over. And then there's a letdown. And then there's New Year's. And more hurrah! And we drink ourselves silly, and then now it's just winter. The endless bleakness of winter. Now, I know not everyone feels that way. I know a lot of people find a lot of joy in what Christmas is in this country and this culture. But for me, this kind of Christmas is exhausting, tedious, and difficult. My family and I, we've talked about this a lot lately, and we're pretty turned off this year of what the North American kind of cultural Christmas is. And I think part of the problem is a matter of tone, because the more traditional ways of celebrating winter holidays have always this sense of a turning point from a time of darkness towards the beginnings, but not culmination of a time of light. And so to begin this time of moving into this space, we occasionally do some ritual elements. We're religious humanists, so we value ritual, but we do it playfully. And so today, I wanted as a starting point of acknowledging that for many of us, the holiday seasons are not always shiny and bright and perfect. I want to say to recognize that. And if we talk more about this history, I think it'll make it more of a comfort that things aren't always easy. But as a way of also expressing hope in the midst of this, I wanted to light some candles here. And I'm going to say a prayer I know from Hebrew. I'm going to do a variation of traditional prayer sung at Shabbat. But this is really a prayer that my intention of this is really not so much as to the prayer itself, but just as a setting apart of this time and of acknowledging darkness, but also acknowledging the hope we have in it. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lala lifnei shel Tuesday. By the way, if you notice that part at the end, normally you'd say Shabbat, if it's Shabbat, or you'd say I'm lighting the candles because it's Hanukkah for Hanukkah, but Hanukkah's passed. So I decided that Tuesday is as good of a reason as any to light candles. So those look a little weird on camera, but we will try that. By the way, I'm experimenting a little bit on the audio side of things. Jeff, let me know how that works. I've moved the mic just a little bit. Also, just a reminder again, post comments, Facebook or Zoom. We're watching both of those platforms. So we now have the candles lit. We've created a space. I now want to tell a story. I want to begin thinking about what life was like for prehistoric human beings. In other words, we're talking about the earliest of human beings that looked like you and I. Oh, good. That sounds better. So that human beings that looked like you and I, basically big hominoids, but who don't have much hair except in a few places. We don't have the fur that most animals have covering us, which means we're fairly vulnerable in a very scary world. Prehistoric human beings were probably hunter-gatherers, meaning we hunted as we could to catch small game, sometimes larger game if we were lucky. We tried to catch fish and other things. We gathered fruits, berries, nuts. But for the most part, it was a hard scrabble existence, a lot of wandering, a lot of movement. One of the reasons why human beings, we walk well on two legs is because we are meant to move. In the midst of this, though, we know prehistory means there's not things written down. We're talking 100,000 years ago or more even. And in this time period, we do know, though, we have artifacts. We have bits of what human beings left behind. Besides their bones, we also have their artifacts, things left by them, including the ancient cave paintings found in many parts of the world. And these cave paintings are extremely, extremely old. And they show a great deal of understanding of the world around them. Depictions of animals that no longer exist today. They've long been extinct. We see their life of hunting. We see what they were about. We also see, though, that they had an understanding of astronomy, of the sun, moon, and stars. We know this by the way some of the cave paintings were laid out as being perfect astronomical maps. And so what we believe, and again, we're dealing with prehistory, we're always doing a lot of conjecture. We're always making assumptions based on the limited evidence we have. And so we don't know for sure, but what we can tell, it looks like the earliest of human beings must have found a great deal of comfort in meaning in the very predictable patterns of the skies. When they saw the sun rise on one side and set on another, when they saw the moon move in predictable patterns and change its shape from blackness to a crescent to a half, all the way to a full moon and then back. This constant waxing and waning, going back and forth, this pattern that endlessly goes over and over again. This was of great comfort to ancient peoples, it appears, because it told them that things, that in the midst of the unpredictability of the world they lived in, the sky was constantly changing too, but it was doing so predictably. And so what we believe is that for ancient prehistoric peoples, that they saw from this world of these patterns of predictability, that they began developing stories to explain who they were and what they were about. And throughout the world, different parts of the world, we see these stories developing. We also see the skies themselves being used as the beginning of the concept of time and the concept of calendars, that these are embedded in, this is when humans became really aware of these things, is when calendars began to be created. And we see this in many cultures. We're developed in parallel forms that one part of the world may not have known what another part of the world was doing. A great example, of course, is the examples of the Mayan calendar systems. They had no understanding of what was being done on the other side of the world with calendars, and yet calendars and concepts of years and various ways of tracking time were developing parallel ways. And over time, that it appears to that religious rituals developed, often tied to the skies, tied to what they were seeing. In other words, they were seeing phenomenon, and then they were explaining them to themselves and their children. This is why things happen. So in other words, when a kid is scared that it's getting dark at night, a parent says, no, the sun will always come back, and here's why it will happen. And stories began to develop to explain why the sun always does come back, why the moon always comes back, what these patterns look like. And so world religions arguably have their roots in this. And interestingly enough, even though we may be very estranged from the phenomenon of nature, as human beings today, most of us, unless you happen to be a farmer, an avid gardener, or someone who spends a lot of time outdoors, bicycle commuters, they know the weather. But the rest of us, most of us, we are, the weather, all it matters for us is wardrobe choices for the most part. It's not a big deal. You ask the average American, average person anywhere, hey, what cycle is the moon in? Can they tell you? No, because it's not a part of our lives. We are surrounded by electric lights when it's nighttime. In the daytime, we're often indoors. We're estranged from the world we live in. And so these things become less meaningful than they once did. And yet, interestingly to me, is that the power of these lights. And here we have these candles. These are simple candles. Why do people buy so many candles? Think about that. In fact, I read a study in Denmark. They buy almost double the candles per capita than almost any other part of the world. Why? Well, their culture actually has a word for it. I forgot the name, but it's this word of coziness, of healthiness. They have a special word to describe this. But human beings are drawn, I think, to candles because it's a reminder of the times when we weren't surrounded by artificial light. And instead, that candles and this kind of natural light was all we had. And it was a reminder that there's something primeval about it. It's why people are drawn to campfires, to bonfires. Look at even big things like Burning Man, where they burn a giant, that giant thing they burn at Burning Man. Why do people do that? I think it's because of these archetypal ideas, things that are embedded deep within us in our DNA and our spirits, however you want to conceptualize it, those things that draw us to these things. So now let's talk about the winter holidays in this context, because I want to argue today, and I'm going to talk about two winter holidays, Hanukkah and then the Advent Christmas season of Christianity. There are many, many others, and I debated about bringing on a guest today to talk about, for instance, winter solstice from the Wiccan tradition, and I think we'll definitely be doing that next year. There are so many other winter holidays we could talk about. I decided, though, for this one to focus on what I really know and talk about that, and that is Hanukkah and Christmas. But again, if you're coming from a different tradition or curious about another tradition, these ideas, I think you're going to find connecting points. So for Hanukkah, to look at Hanukkah, we need to now go back in time again. But this time we're not going to prehistory. We're going to go to history, the time of written language. And yet history in this case is still hazy because the players here, they have left their recorded accounts of what happened. We have archaeology. Sometimes recorded accounts line up with archaeology. Sometimes they do not. But we look at the history of the Jewish people, who before that were the nation of Israel, before that were the Hebrew people. They had their founding stories in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as they're called. And archaeology backs up some of the events of the Torah, most of them not. In other words, these are myths, these are legends. They might be based upon real events of oral history lost to recorded other kinds of archaeological and whatnot history, but they are founding stories. And if we look at these founding stories in more detail, particularly the earliest ones, such as the Genesis stories of creation, what we can see is that these stories in many ways were rewrites of previous traditions, mostly in Babylonia. The Babylonians had a complex sets of mythology and stories of how they came to be and what the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and how all this came to be. And so the Hebrew retelling of the story was done, but with a twist, and I think a very helpful twist. I would argue, if you look at the Babylonian mythologies, they tended to not show human beings in a positive light. The Hebrew mythologies said human beings are made in the image of God. Human beings are created and special, the pinnacle of creation. But nonetheless, even though that's a different theological message, the underlying stories, many of them are very similar. Stories of creation, stories of a flood. These stories go back older than the Hebrew scriptures. And so with that understanding, we'd have to say that these ideas of seasonal change are very much embedded in this tradition, the Hebrew tradition especially. And so many of the holidays of the Jewish calendar are rooted in the seasons and rooted in how different societies interpreted these things. And the Hebrew society in its earliest days was kind of at that changing point from hunter-gatherer to more now of herding cultures, of herding animals, domesticating animals, and agriculture. We're still very early on. And when we get from archaeologies, the earliest peoples, the Hebrew peoples, were probably highland people in what's now Palestine, Israel, who were being dominated by their neighbors in the lowlands. And the lowlands were more developed city-states, more developed political structures, kings and whatnot. The people in the highlands were a little bit more of an anarchist direction. And there's been some good stuff written on this, by the way. This isn't original to me. Lots of people talk about this. And of course, we have the story of the Exodus. It's very possible there was an exodus of sorts, of slaves escaping slavery in Egypt. But it looks like what possibly may have happened if there was an exodus, was a much smaller number, and that these group of escaped slaves may have at some point united with these highland peoples in what's now Palestine, Israel, and they became the Hebrew people. And the mythology, the story of leaving Exodus was such a powerful, compelling story that this may have, the whole people may have in time saw this as their story, even though many of them, their ancestors were not those who left Egypt, but were those from those highlands. So anyway, if we start moving forward in time, this loose grouping of tribes becomes united over time towards a king. And this begins, first with the King Saul, but much like right after it's King David, who's the beginning of the Davidic dynasty. Not long after that, you had Solomon, and then a split of the kingdom into a northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom, both kingdoms survived for several hundred years. Eventually, the northern kingdom was conquered and assimilated into their neighbors, no longer existed as a separate political entity. In the south, the nation of Judah lasted longer, but it finally was conquered by the Babylonians. Their elite was sent into exile in Babylon. Later, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians. And then the Persian king, I believe it was Cyrus, then allowed some of the elites from Babylon to go back to Judea, particularly to their holy city of Jerusalem, to rebuild the city and rebuild their temple. However, this was a very turning point in Jewish history, because probably the majority of Jews did not go back from captivity. They stayed in Babylon. They stayed in diaspora. So Judaism by this point had been established as a diaspora religion. So the city was rebuilt. The temple was rebuilt. But then after this, after the Persian Empire fell, the Greek Empire came into play. And the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great didn't stay united together very long. It was split into various chunks. And before long, those various chunks were constantly fighting amongst each other. And guess who was caught in the middle of this always? It was the little bitty country of Judea. And so in the midst of this, they at times were semi-autonomous. At times, they were completely isolated. Times are completely dominated. But throughout this, there was always this tension of wanting to be their own country. At the same time, for many people, particularly for the rich and the elite, they liked what they saw in the Greek culture. They liked the refinements that they saw. So more and more people being drawn to the Greek culture. And what happened in the midst of this was many of the poor people, or the more traditionally religious, didn't like this, and they wanted to fight back. And so finally, when the Greek cultural elements became more coercive, and in other words, an intentional attempt to wipe out the traditional Jewish culture, there began a revolution led by a group called the Maccabees. And they fought back, and eventually, after a time of struggle, they achieved some degree of liberation, retaking the holy city of Jerusalem, retaking the temple. And so when they retook the temple, they decided they were going to rededicate it to its original purposes. And so in doing this, we want to have a big celebration. And the thing in those days was the biggest holiday of the calendar for them was Sukkah, the pilgrimage holiday from a few months before in the fall. It was a celebration of harvest. It was also a celebration of reminders of Exodus, because people would live in tents, shacks, temporary dwellings for this 8-day long festival. And what did they do in the tents? They celebrated. They ate good food. They drank wine. People had sex, and a lot of it. That really is a big deal for Sukkah. Doing it in the Sukkah was what people did during Sukkah. It was a big deal. So it was wine, women, song, the whole everything. Sukkah was a really, really big deal. Now, the problem was that year they couldn't do Sukkah. They had a war going on. So the decision was made, well, since we're going to rededicate this temple, let's just do an extra Sukkah in the wintertime. Well, there's a problem. Legend tells us that they only had so much oil in the temple. Now, bear in mind, the key thing here is that this is legend, not history. The written accounts, the earliest accounts, do not mention anything about this story, but the legends developed do have it. And in the legends, the story goes that they only had so much oil, enough for just one day of the festival. But miraculously, the oil extended for 8 days. And so that was seen as the miracle of Hanukkah, and why today people light candles for Hanukkah. So after that first Hanukkah, the word was sent out from Jerusalem to Jews in diaspora. Especially, we know about it in Egypt. We assume it went to other places as well, encouraging them to celebrate this holiday as well. And Hanukkah became its own thing. It was no longer a substitute Sukkah. It was its own holiday. But because it's not mentioned in Torah, it's a later developed holiday. It was a minor holiday, not the most important holiday by any stretch, until we get to the US of A in the last 150 years or so, when Hanukkah took on deeper significance by Jews in a diaspora context, a pluralistic society, as an alternative to Christmas because of its already growing consumer draw of it, especially to Jewish young people. And so Hanukkah was reinvented with a new kind of emphasis. Now, what I find interesting, I've given you a lot of history here, but in Hanukkah, looking at it, in one sense, it's a commemoration of one minor battle way back in the day. Or, it was a major battle, but at the end, I should also add the Maccabees. They were heroes at one point in time in the Jewish tradition, but later their descendants became corrupted. They became corrupt political leaders. And so because of that, Hanukkah had to take on a different meaning, because it wasn't just the oppression was from the Greeks and later the Romans, it was from the rich and elite of their own country. And so Hanukkah took on a different meaning, a spiritualized meaning, emphasizing the idea of light in darkness. Now, where does that come from? Maybe that's going back to those archetypal ideas, going back to the idea of winter solstice, literally the longest night of the year, the shortest day of the year. Maybe it's that yearning to connect with those ancient patterns going back to prehistory. At least that's what I'd like to think. Well, next, sorry, it's winter season, itchy nose season. I next want to talk about the Christmas seasons of Advent and Christmas. And real quick, before I do that, I'm going to check over on Facebook, see if we have any comments so far. Okay, well, I just want to remind everyone, if you're watching this, feel free to leave us comments. We love comments. One, it just lets us know you're watching, but also it lets you join the conversation. So your thoughts, please share them, either on Facebook or on Zoom. So now, jumping back over, let's continue our conversation. We're going to talk about Advent and Christmas. And bear in mind, earlier we talked about the consumer Christmas extravaganza. It begins at Black Friday, ends with Christmas. It's all high note the whole time, all hop, top, top, top. We don't have any low notes. Well, Advent is very different. The traditional conception of Advent and Christmas is very different because, again, we're going to go back to history in a moment. It begins in a low point. It ends on a slightly higher point, but still is a low point. In other words, it's a recognition that winter is still on, but there's hope in this. So in telling this bit of the story, I want to go back to the story of the Maccabees. I talked about them a moment ago. They liberated the people. They had some degree of autonomy for a while. But then what happened? Those various Greek bits of the Greek Empire and the other neighboring countries, there was constant contention, and the land of Judea was right in the middle of everything. It was the epicenter of all kinds of conflicts. So because of that, they were the people in Judea, and the government that was left there was constantly having to broker deals with their neighbors to try to survive. Often it'd mean a pledge of loyalty one way or another. Sometimes it would involve paying of taxes or becoming more of a subservient vassal state. So in the midst of all these conflicts, at some point or another, the elite leadership reached out to the Romans for help. And initially, yes, that saved the day. And then it didn't, because help from the Romans always comes with strings. Normally it begins with the payment of tributes and taxes. Later on, it means the Romans get to pick who your kings are. Eventually, the Romans pick who your prime priest is. It was more and more control and oppression. Now, in the midst of all of this oppression, there were some people that made off like bandits. The rich people, like they always do. Every culture and society, some people make money, even in the times of terrible oppression. And that's what happened. The rich and elite did just that. But other people didn't do so well, particularly poor people. And in the midst of this, and we have poor people and traditionally religious people didn't always do so well. In the midst of this, though, there were multiple movements that formed of how do you resist this. Some took the approach of head off to the hills, do our own thing, wait for redemption to come. Others said, let's build up an army. Let's start training in guerrilla warfare. Others said, just keep praying where you're at. But for many of these people, they were motivated by this concept that had become important in the Jewish tradition called the Mashiach, or the Anointed One. And this goes back to some of the scriptures in the Jewish tradition that speak of the Davidic line, Davidic kings. And some of them, for instance, Psalm 2, which we've talked about in the Psalms class we're doing through the Objector Institute, are one of these coronation hymns, or written to be sung or prayed during the coronation of a new king. And so for many people, though, these prayers, these songs were grandiose. They spoke of this time of great prosperity that never had happened. So many people assumed, hey, maybe these weren't actually coronation hymns from the old days, but rather they were prophetic things about the times to come. And so people started thinking that there would be not just any old king, not just another petty political ruler like their corrupt rulers they had at the time, but rather this Mashiach, an anointed one who's chosen by God, anointed with oil as a symbol of that, and now would bring about this new era. And so many people looked forward to this. And we'll talk later more about how the Christian tradition reinterpreted this Mashiach idea. And again, this is a lot more we could say about this. But from the Christian perspective, there was a reinterpretation of saying that instead of Mashiach being a political ruler who would bring about this golden era, they interpret this as being a spiritual ruler, and that they believed it would be Jesus. And so I want to read now a song, and this comes from the book of Luke in the Christian tradition. And it's a song that was said to be sung by Mary, the mother of Jesus. And this song, where are my glasses? Oh, well, we'll make do. This song was said to have been sung by her when she met her relative Elizabeth, who was also going to be bearing a child, also according to the story by miraculous means. By the way, Mary, I should add about her, she was, what we do know is that from her culture and time, she probably was very young, 14, 15, 16 years old. Likely was not formally educated, but I think would have had certainly a good deal of more informal training just from being a part of synagogue observances and whatnot. Of course, according to the story, she was a virgin. You know, I, as a bit of a skeptic, don't really go with that. I just don't see it as important. What we do know is that she had an understanding that God told her that her child would be this Mashiach. We know that. That's what she believed. How she came to be pregnant, that's a matter of faith. But as a matter of the story goes, what is clear that she had this understanding of Mashiach, and she thought her son would have a part to play in this. So I'm going to read this song now, and again, know that this is being said by a young woman in an occupied country, and she is not only in that occupied country, but she is part of a lower class of people who have even less power and autonomy in this. And so it says, Mary praises God. Mary said, with all my heart I glorify the Lord. In the depths of who I am, I rejoice in God my Savior. He has looked with favor on the low status of his servant. Look, from now on, everyone will consider me highly favored, because the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. He shows mercy to everyone from one generation to the next who honors him as God. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered those with arrogant thoughts and proud inclination. He has pulled the powerful down from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty-handed. He has come to the aid of his servant Israel, remembering his mercy, just as he promised to our ancestors, to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants forever. Okay, now, in this text, what we just said, and again, scholars, many of them don't think Mary said this. They say that an uneducated peasant girl couldn't have composed something so important, so theologically nuanced and significant. Personally, I think this is a bit of sexism playing into the scholarship. I can't help but say, of all the things in scriptures, I think this actually may be one of the things that's most likely to be fairly authentic. Because in their patriarchal days, for a woman to be saying this, for a woman to be delivering this message would have almost been an embarrassment in their culture and time. But they didn't have Joseph saying this, they had Mary saying it. I can't help but think that's really important. And I think it shows that while these may not be the exact words Mary said, I think there's a very high likelihood that the writer of this particular gospel, Luke, who we know from earlier back in chapter 1, was a compiler of other texts, someone who looked at other versions of the story and wrote his own version, may have used as source material someone who knew Mary personally, who told the story to her. And this may be, it's also very possible the source of this could have been Mary herself. It could have been someone else, but it likely would have been another woman. And Luke, as someone we see from other places in his Gospels, one who tended to value the voices of women more than the other Gospel writers. So I take this as very authentic compared to other stuff. And so to me, what's important here is looking at the political undertones. That says he has shown strength in his arm. He has scattered those with arrogant thoughts and proud inclinations. He has pulled the powerful down from their thrones, lifted up the holy, filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich away empty-handed. Woo! Now, amazingly to me, there's a lot of churches in the United States today that will read this prayer this time of year without a hint of irony, without questioning, why do we favor the rich so much in our churches and in our society? Certainly Mary didn't. She thought the rich should be dispossessed of their ill-gotten gain, and she thought that God would be bringing that about. Certainly seems the complete opposite of the consumer Christmas extravaganza, which is all about buying, 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 and having more and more money being sent from the pockets of the poor to the rich. This is very personal to me, and I'll tell you why. My father is a bankruptcy attorney, and for times in my life I've worked with him, both as a paralegal before I became a lawyer, and at times I've worked also as a lawyer during bankruptcy. I don't do bankruptcy law today. It's too much, it's a very technical area of law, and I focus on military law these days. When I've done bankruptcy law in the past, what I learned was that a lot of folks who are struggling, when it comes time for Christmas time, they feel guilty because they feel like, oh, we've had to do without all year long. My kids haven't had enough of this, that, or the other. And so they overspend at Christmas. They go into debt and they hope it'll get better, but they do it they put their faith and hope in the consumer Christmas, Santa Claus. And that guy does not deliver the goods. Because what happens after Christmas? They're even broker. And so now they're desperate. Now they don't even have enough money to pay a lawyer to file bankruptcy. So they wait till February, and then predictably, February, March is the after Christmas bankruptcy rush of everyone who finally overextend themselves at Christmas, now have to patch it all up in February or March. To me, what I find just boggling about that is what happens then with this whole system of people going in debt, and a very small percentage of people going bankrupt, by the way. Most people just go further in debt but are stuck there. What's happening is it's a redistribution of wealth, but it's not from the rich to the poor, it's from the poor to the rich. My challenge, what I want us to think about is, how can we turn this around? Mary certainly would have been in favor of that, a reversal. So anyway, that was Mary's song. And so we now, in the celebration of Advent in the traditional Christian calendar, Advent has this poignancy of Mary's song, a time of oppression, a time when things are very dark, but looking towards something better. And bear in mind, we also, when we think about the Christmas event itself, we think about the birth of Jesus in a lowly stable with the angels and the shepherds and the goats and sheep and all that. We tend to paint this as a pretty picture, but I had one of my mentors in ministry and activism, Moses Mast, former minister, a few ministers ago at Joy Mennonite Church. He said that this is not a pretty picture. This is an ugly picture. You have to put yourselves in the positions of those people there. Can you imagine, if you were a woman, having to give birth in a stable? Not a clean place, not a comfortable bed, but in a stable, a filthy stable. If you're a man, can you imagine that you're so poor you can't provide a safe place for your wife to give birth? How that would have felt. That kind of degradation, that you're asking for help. You have a woman who's about to give birth, your wife right here, and they can't find room for her. They say, oh yeah, you can sleep in the barn if you want. That's all we can do for you. That's not a pretty picture. This is an ugly picture. In fact, if we want to think about that, the best comparison today would be if we have a situation where that maybe a woman is giving birth in a refugee camp in a tent. It'd be about the same thing. That's what we're dealing with. This isn't a pretty picture. And yet, in the Advent story, in the midst of extreme oppression, extreme darkness, and bear in mind, why were Mary and Joseph, according to the story, sent down to Bethlehem? To pay taxes that they couldn't afford. Why did, after Jesus' birth, their family had to flee to Egypt and go into refugee status? Why are they wandering? Because they're poor, because they're oppressed. This is what this story is about. It's about oppression and resistance to oppression, what that looks like, and how that sometimes in the darkest of times, you have to look for some light. You have to defiantly light a candle because you don't have anything else. And so Christmas is the turning point, of course, and like winter solstice is that turning point. However, it's not still all bright and shiny, at least in the traditional sense. There's still the recognition that oppression is still here. We only have the hope that maybe this Messiah, this anointed one, might do something about it. So, coming back full circle now, if we think about looking at these traditions and other traditions, I mean, I've only spoken about Hanukkah and Advent and Christmas because those are the ones I'm familiar with. But in these traditions, we see, again, to me, some archetypal themes that to me resonate with the old winter solstice idea of increasing darkness, the turning point, increasing light. And I think when we ignore that natural pattern, I think we are missing something. And I think for a lot of us, when we feel that letdown after Christmas, we feel like, oh, we survived. That's all I can say about it. I think part of the problem is we're trying to be something we weren't programmed for. But I think if you want to take it from a DNA standpoint, a spiritual standpoint, I think that human beings, we were evolved, we were created, whatever you want to frame it, to be in this natural world. And when we can use our rituals and our ceremonies to tie us to that, I think we're going to be better off. So that's my challenge to you, those of you watching today. I want to encourage you that whatever traditions you do this winter season, to think about these tones and think about maybe it's okay that things aren't always bright and happy all the time. One, I think there have been some good correctives here. By the way, I'm going to real quick check on Facebook, see if we have any comments over there. So we'll do that real quick before I jump back over here. Okay. So any comments, questions, please post them. Also, for those of you listening later in recorded form, love to hear your comments. Send them to me at james@objector.church. But what my challenge is, as we think about whatever celebrations you do this time of year, to think about the issue of tone and think about what can we do maybe to reboot things a little bit. There's been some good attempts. There's an idea called the Advent Conspiracy, and you can find out stuff about that online. But another thing I really like, many churches do what's called, or at least a few churches do what's called the longest night of the year service. And I first went to this about a dozen years ago at a Presbyterian church, and it was set for winter solstice, and it was meant to be a time of lamentation, of grief and mourning for people who had gone through a great loss in the previous year. And the idea being that for many people, the holidays are a difficult time, particularly if they've lost a loved one. So it's a time of recognition of that and providing space for that. And it was a deeply, deeply moving service. I think that's unfortunate, though, particularly in the Christian tradition, there isn't a lot of space for that to happen. The Jewish tradition has a lot more of that each week. In the Shabbat service, traditionally, there is the mourner's Kaddish, a prayer that's prayed in memory of those who have passed on. I think that's a very helpful concept. But I think whatever it looks like, whether it's even something that's made new, there's nothing to say that any of these rituals and holidays, that they're holy because we make them holy. And if holidays we have and the rituals we have are not working for us, we can make new ones. We're okay. That's our right as human beings. My challenge is to think about the emotional tone, to look at the flow of things, and to find ways that connect with who we really are in our natural lives. Well, that's what I'm going to leave us with for this week. Just a few reminders again. Friday, 5 p.m. Central Time, Nappy Ritz Bookstore in Oklahoma City. Join us there if you'd like to come for a live remote event here in Oklahoma City, or join us online. Also, if you have thoughts about rescheduling, send us an email. I'm going to announce something probably the next couple of days for our ongoing schedule. We might stay with Tuesdays if folks like Tuesdays, but if you have a different idea, please let us know. And finally, our Psalms class that just started, the first 2 or 3 lectures are online now at Objector.institute. So I'll have some more information about that soon as well. And there's lots of other stuff going on, but we'll leave it at that for today. Thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in. And I'm going to be on for like 1 more minute just in case anyone has any questions, comments, etc. And I don't see anything else, so we will close out for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you on Friday.